So thanks for coming out tonight. I went yesterday to see what was on Ross Douthat's Twitter feed. And it reminded me, if reminding was needed, that Twitter's an open sewer, and that those who venture onto it trying to say something serious have to wade through a lot of effluvium. And Douthat's feed was particularly awful because he'd written a piece in that notoriously fringe publication, the New York Times, in which he'd offered measured praise for the late President George H.W. Bush, and then he'd offered tempered and seriously qualified praise for the WASP establishment that had produced Bush. His distilled argument was that the recent outpouring of Bush nostalgia is a longing for something America used to have and doesn't really have anymore, a ruling class that was widely, not universally, but more widely than today, deemed legitimate, and that inspired various kinds of trust, intergenerational, institutional, conspicuously absent in our society today. I think it's fair to say woke Twitter didn't like it and let him know it. But what struck me about Douthat's response was that he responded not with ad hominem or snark, but with a rumination about the inability of humans to transcend nature and what it says about our current politics. We've carved out a greater measure of control, he reckoned, but we are still ruled, not the rulers, hostages to fortune, not masters of our fate, which is why the old religions seem relevant to a lot of people, because the world is a little kinder, but we are not its gods. The whole exchange reminded me why I've been trying, since 2012, my email tells me, to get Douthat here to speak at Ohio University for the George Washington Forum, and I'm glad he's able to come. Because he combines a willingness to say precisely what he thinks about politics and culture with an almost unfailingly good temper and with an eye to the far horizon of eternity. He's written a twice-weekly opinion column for the New York Times since 2009, and before joining the Times, he was a senior editor at The Atlantic. A graduate of Harvard, he's the author of Bad Religion, How We Became a Nation of Heretics, Privilege, Harvard and the Education of the Ruling Class, and with Reihan Salam, Grand New Party, How Republicans Can Win the Working Class and Save the American Dream. His latest book is To Change the Church, Pope Francis and the Future of Catholicism. He visits us here tonight as a guest of the George Washington Forum on American Ideas, Politics, and Institutions. The Washington Forum doesn't receive federal funding but relies on private donations, and I'm happy to be able to say that tonight's talk is underwritten by generous donations of Ohio University alumni and staff, and by a grant from the Charles Koch Foundation and a grant from the Thomas W. Smith Foundation through the Jack Miller Center. I want to thank them all for helping bring Ross to OU, and I hope you'll join with me in welcoming him here tonight.
So I'm speaking into this mic, and this mic is recording me. Is that right? Yeah, excellent. Thank you guys so much for coming tonight. It's always a dangerous thing to have a speaking engagement begin by someone else reading from your Twitter feed. You know, your heart skips a beat and so on. And ideally, you know, Twitter would be illegal and nobody would be on it, but this is the fallen world we live in. Thank you guys so much for coming tonight. Thanks to the program and the university for having me. I'm going to talk a little bit on the theme of the state of conservatism in the years of Donald Trump. When you give talks like this, they always ask you for a title months in advance, and I offered a title months in advance, and I've basically forgotten what it was, but it's something about a workers' party or a white party. Is that it? Exactly. See, it was always somewhere up there. About conservative populism, basically, in the age of Donald Trump. So what I'm going to talk tonight about is basically what I see as the history of the working class's relationship to conservative politics and the Republican Party in America, going back to basically 50 or 60 years ago, and how that relationship set the stage for the very strange presidency of Donald Trump. And then I'll end with some sort of very hypothetical thoughts about where that relationship might go in the future. And then I'll take questions from you guys on any subject under the sun, including whether it was a good idea once upon a time to have a WASP establishment. So I'll start with a period in American history, let's say the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt through the presidency of Lyndon Johnson, when the idea of conservatism as a populist movement, of conservatism as something sort of defined by the American working class, of the Republican Party as a quote-unquote workers' party, which is what Donald Trump at one point on the campaign trail said he wanted to build, when all of that would have seemed like almost a contradiction in terms. Because in the United States, in American politics as it existed under Roosevelt and into the post-war period and really into the 1960s, the party of the working class, the party of labor unions, the party of white ethnics, the party of blue-collar workers was the Democratic Party. And the allegiance of the American working class to the Democratic Party was forged across many decades and very complicated political story, but you could simplify it in certain ways and just say that working class America liked New Deal liberalism. They liked the fact that in the aftermath of the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt and the Democratic Party built the basic foundations of what we think of as our welfare state today. Expanded unemployment insurance, created Social Security, and generally created a set of programs that seemed to offer a real safety net to a society where the experience of the Great Depression had been catastrophic for most Americans who were in one way or another workers who earned their income from wages rather than from investments or business profits. Not that people who earned their income from investments did that well in the beginning of the Great Depression either. It was a general catastrophe, but obviously it fell hardest on working class America. And so working class America liked the Democratic program, appreciated the Democratic program, and looked at the Republican Party as the party of the upper middle class, the party of the small businessman, sometimes the party of big business, not the party that had their interests primarily in mind. So that was the landscape of American politics, again, very roughly going into the 1960s. And then American politics started to change. And it changed in a bunch of different ways. It changed because of changing economic conditions. Increasingly, the American working class became affluent while remaining in some sense working class in a way that they hadn't been in the 1920s and 1930s. The success of the post-World War II economy turned factory workers, blue-collar Americans, into more prosperous Americans. It changed their economic incentives in various ways. It made them think of themselves as taxpayers paying into the system as well as people benefiting from the safety net. So that was one big change. The second big change was the social revolutions of the 1960s. The sexual revolution above all, but the general changing cultural landscape, which essentially severed what had been a fairly effective synthesis within the Democratic Party between a kind of economic liberalism that wanted to build a welfare state and spend money, and a kind of pro-family social conservatism that saw the two-parent heterosexual family as the basic building block of society, and worked through regulation and spending and cultural habits and forms to basically create a landscape where there was a kind of family wage, a breadwinner wage that was supposed to support a dad who worked usually, a mom who stayed home and took care of the kids, and this was sort of connected in various ways to Social Security and the sort of general landscape of the New Deal welfare state. That synthesis of social conservatism and economic liberalism didn't survive the 1960s and 1970s. Increasingly, from the 1960s onward, the Democratic Party and liberalism became more socially liberal, accepting first the divorce revolution, becoming very gradually, but eventually in a thoroughgoing way, the party of abortion rights, eventually becoming the party that supported same-sex marriage, and becoming, especially in its whiter portions, an increasingly secular party that, if it wasn't actively hostile to religious belief, was at least skeptical of conservative religious traditions, moral conservatism, social conservatism, and so on. And so those portions of the working class, especially that were Catholic or that were religiously conservative in certain ways, found themselves increasingly alienated from the Democratic Party, from the party, what had been the party of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, and in that sense, too, drifted in a more politically conservative direction. And then over the same period, you had a kind of crisis of social order that was sort of most usefully distilled in the fact that from the 1960s onward, crime rates went up staggeringly in every American city all across the country. And the governing class of the United States, which was primarily liberal Democrats, seemed to have no idea what to do about it. And you had a period of essentially white flight, mostly working class white flight from inner cities and sort of old working class neighborhoods into the suburbs. And with that flight came increasingly a sort of political incentive for and an appetite for tough on crime policies, basically, that Republican politicians increasingly offered as a way to win working class voters who saw the cities as increasingly ungovernable. And I'm just listing things, but it's a long list. And over the same period, you had the Vietnam War, which created an intense general polarization in American society as prior conflicts had not. And again, in that polarization, there was a clear class polarization, where working class Americans tended to be more supportive of the war, more vehemently patriotic, more skeptical of the anti-war movement, which was seen often as a movement of college students and hippie kids who wanted to dodge the draft and didn't want to serve, even as working class Americans had to serve. And there, too, there was a drift among working class voters away from the Democratic Party. And then finally, you had, and extremely importantly, you had the role of race, where you had basically from the early 1960s onward what had been a kind of politics of civil rights and politics of race that cut across party lines, where you had pro-civil rights Republicans and anti-civil rights Democrats in the South. Increasingly, the cause of civil rights became associated with the Democratic Party, and skepticism about not the 1964 Civil Rights Act, although there was obviously skepticism about that from Barry Goldwater and others, but increasingly skepticism about affirmative action, about school busing, about various programs intended to sort of push integration further, push the civil rights agenda further. That skepticism tended to be concentrated among white working class voters, white ethnic working class voters. And so there too, you had a move of those voters into the Republican coalition, even as African American voters increasingly sorted into the Democratic Party. And so by the 1970s and by the 1980s, you had a situation where white working class America, not African American working class America and not the then very small Hispanic working class population, but white working class America, still on economic policy tended to be sympathetic towards the Democratic Party and its arguments. It had not become economically libertarian. It still liked Social Security. It still favored Medicare. It still favored certain forms of welfare spending. But because of this tangle of issues surrounding crime and foreign policy and patriotism and racial anxiety, that out of that whole tangle and the working class's greater prosperity, which made working class voters more tax sensitive than they used to be, you had the conditions for Republican politicians, and above all national Republican politicians like Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, to win a growing share of white working class voters, basically. And so you had the emergence of a group that by the 1980s was being described as Reagan Democrats, but they had been in many cases Nixon Democrats before that in 1972. These were voters all across the country, but often, especially in Midwestern states like this one, who still voted Democratic in House races, who were often ticket splitters, but who were voting for Republican politicians in presidential elections, and who were sort of moving the Republican Party into a position where it seemed like there could be a Republican political coalition that would sort of take over from the New Deal coalition and become the natural majority party of the United States. Now that did not fully happen. It partially happened. It happened sort of up to a point across the 1980s and early 1990s. But it didn't happen completely. And what happened across the early 1980s and 1990s was, in effect, the Republican Party won a lot of political victories on many of the issues that had brought working class voters into the Republican coalition, and then it became a victim of its own success, basically. So, you know, if you look at an issue like crime, right? Crime rates in the United States rise pretty steadily with sort of some ups and downs, but a pretty steady rate, a pretty steady rise from the 1960s into the early 1990s, and then for reasons that are very complicated but do have something to do with changing policing strategies and tough on crime policies, start to fall, and with the exception of a slight hiccup in the last couple of years, have basically been falling ever since. So the politics of crime that pulled white working class voters into the Republican coalition stopped being salient over the course of the 1990s and 2000s. Crime stops being an incredibly salient issue. The politics of foreign policy. When Ronald Reagan gets elected in 1980, Vietnam is very close in the rearview mirror. It's seen as this huge disaster for the United States, which of course it was. And it seems like the Soviet Union is still on the march. It's still possible to imagine communism winning the Cold War. And by the end of the Reagan era, certainly by the end of the George H.W. Bush era, the Berlin Wall is down, the Soviet Union is gone, communism, or at least its Soviet variety, is effectively defeated. And this is, in effect, a victory for the Republican coalition. But again, it takes an issue off the table that had been a reason why working class voters were voting for Republicans. The same is true for taxes. When Ronald Reagan gets elected president in 1980, and especially a couple years before a couple of tax reforms were passed in the late 70s, the top marginal rate is in the 70% area, and sort of lower middle class America is basically facing bracket creep, where because of inflation, the tax bracket stays the same, your income rises, but inflation is out of control, so you're not feeling any richer, so the tax code is taking a bigger and bigger bite out of your income. Over the course of the 1980s, inflation was basically whipped, and taxes were cut all across the board, and again, a victory for the Republican coalition that removed a salient issue that had moved these voters into the Republican column. And then, too, even on policies that were sort of intimately connected to racial conflict and racial anxiety, like welfare policy, there was, you know, the Republican Congress in the 1990s passed a welfare reform, and a Democratic president, Bill Clinton, signed it. And with that, too, the politics of welfare and all of sort of the racial tangle of issues around them seemed to recede as a reason for working class voters to vote Republican. And meanwhile, over this same period, the Democratic Party, which, because of working class voters' move into the Republican coalition, had been left with sort of a shrunken version of its earlier coalition. That Democratic Party saw, because of demographic change, that coalition get bigger and bigger and bigger. So if you go back to the 1972 election, when Richard Nixon just destroys George McGovern, and you look at the Democratic coalition in that election, it's a coalition of racial minorities, young people, college students, upper middle class liberals, and unmarried and divorced people, and especially unmarried and divorced women. That coalition accounts for, 35 to 40% of the electorate in 1972. By the early 2000s, that's getting closer to something like a majority coalition. While the constituencies that were voting Republican, white people, white married religious people, and so on, were shrinking. The white working class as a constituency was still a huge part of the American electorate, but it was a much smaller part than it had been 20 or 25 years ago. And it was still the case that the Republican Party, in a kind of basic way, had an economic agenda that was more libertarian, more skeptical of the welfare state, more skeptical of government spending and so on than a lot of the white working class voters who were voting for the Republican Party were. So there was this sort of ongoing tension on economics between the party and those voters, even as all of the other issues that had brought a lot of white working class voters into the Republican coalition were becoming less salient. So that was the situation basically 15 years ago in the early 2000s. And the Republican Party was at that point led by George W. Bush, who some of you may recall being president of the United States not too long ago. And he had a strategist, Karl Rove, who some of you may recall as well. And they had a plan for what you were going to do about this, basically. They said, well, look, you have a lot of voters who think that the Republican Party, who have sort of a broad sympathy for the Republican Party on cultural issues, but think the party is too harsh, too Scrooge-like, too Ayn Randian, too libertarian on economic issues, who think that the Newt Gingrich Congress of the 1990s was too mean-spirited, and who think that the Republican Party, in appealing to these white working class voters, has engaged in racial politics with racial dog whistles and sort of tacit attacks on Black America for far too long. And so we're going to solve both of those problems. We're going to have something called compassionate conservatism. So compassionate conservatism is basically an attempt to turn the Republican Party into not just a white party in a demographically changing country, but more of a pan-ethnic party with more Hispanic votes, more African American votes, and also to hold on to a lot of those sort of working class voters who felt like the party under Newt Gingrich was too mean-spirited. And so basically compassionate conservatism says, look, we're going to imitate the Democrats on a bunch of issues. They favor a prescription drug benefit, we're going to favor a prescription drug benefit. They want to spend more money on education, we want to spend more money on education. We just want to do it through charter schools and voucher programs and sort of, these sort of alternatives to the existing public school bureaucracy. And we're going to use each of these issues to basically either win over or hold on to a particular part of this attempted pan-ethnic coalition. So by spending more money on healthcare and prescription drugs and creating Medicare Part D and so on, we're going to hold on to especially older white working class voters who like the welfare state, like the safety net, and otherwise might drift away from us. By spending on education, by spending on faith-based initiatives in the inner city, by doing all that kind of thing, we're going to do outreach to African Americans in a way that the Republican Party under Nixon and Reagan hadn't really done. And then we're going to do a comprehensive immigration reform that legalizes a lot of illegal immigrants, and that's going to help us win over Hispanics. And meanwhile, we're going to cut taxes so that the libertarian part of our party is happy, and we're going to be, pro-life, anti-same-sex marriage to keep the socially conservative part of our party happy. And by the way, lots of African Americans and Hispanics are religious and socially conservative, and so that will help bring them into the fold too, and it will all work out really well, and we'll have sort of, in effect, completed the transformation of the Republican Party into the new majority party of the United States by basically moving it towards the center on economics, by doing more racial outreach, and remaining the party of tax cuts and some kind of soft religious conservatism. That was the Bush theory. And if you go back to the 2004 election, which was, a pretty narrow victory for Bush, but one that a lot of people in the media did not fully expect. In the aftermath of the 2004 election, there was this sense, not just among Republicans, but among a lot of observers, especially liberal observers, that this had worked. That, and it had worked in part because 9/11 had happened and it had returned the salience of national security to the front of American politics, but it had also worked because Karl Rove was a genius, right? And Republicans had won 35 or 40% of the Hispanic vote instead of 30%. They'd even won a little more of the African American vote in Ohio, which had put them over the top against Kerry, in part because of the campaign against same-sex marriage and African American pastors who supported it. And meanwhile, they had done Medicare Part D, and they had held on to a lot of senior citizen voters, and they'd won a lot of working class voters who had swung back to the Democrats under Bill Clinton, and it had all worked, and there were literally books written after the 2004 election about how this was the new permanent Republican majority. It was 14 years ago. I remember it like it was yesterday, but I don't really remember yesterday. And so that was sort of what the landscape looked like after 2004 to a lot of people, that the Republican Party had finally, after winning the working class on one set of issues in the 70s and 80s, had finally sort of pulled them fully into its coalition and expanded that coalition in necessary ways and become a New Deal type majority party for the United States. That was all wrong. And it was wrong for a variety of reasons, but above all because George W. Bush's second term was punctuated by two epic disasters. One of them, the occupation of Iraq, and the second one, the global financial crisis, which itself was not directly caused by, but connected to one of these clever, compassionate conservative policies. Because one of the many things that Bush and Karl Rove thought that they could do to hold working class voters and hold white working class voters and win over Hispanic voters was to encourage home ownership, right? What was more likely to make a working class American or a new immigrant into a natural Republican than to help support them buy their own home and let that be sort of a lucrative investment for them going forward as they had kids and raised kids and so on. And of course that turned out not to be the wisest thing for the government to subsidize at that particular moment in American and Western history. And at the same time, Bush had started his second term, again, after sort of campaigning generally on this sort of center-right message and doing all this outreach by trying to do Social Security reform, which was not popular, was precisely the kind of Republican policy proposal that working class voters tended not to like, and which too was extraordinarily badly timed in the sense that Bush spent the first year of his second term trying and failing to persuade Congress to pass something that would let people put some of their Social Security money into the stock market, and then just a little while later the stock market totally collapsed and you've barely heard anything about Social Security privatization since. So that was basically the story of Bush's second term, where this seeming new Republican coalition effectively collapsed. And Barack Obama was elected president, and suddenly, as it does, the political media turned completely around, and after saying, Karl Rove has built a permanent Republican majority in 2005, they started saying, oh, guess what, now there's a permanent Democratic majority, because Obama has pulled back a bunch of white working class voters. In 2008, Obama really did win a significant chunk of the white working class. And at the same time, he's ridden these sort of emerging demographic groups, Hispanics, minorities, recent immigrants, secular voters, female voters, college graduates, young voters, all of them to a resounding victory. And this is the new Democratic coalition. And it's all going to work really, really well. And the Republican Party responded to Obama's election by going a tiny bit crazy, as losing parties often do in American politics these days. And the consensus among Republicans for a brief period of time was that, okay, we tried this George W. Bush compassionate conservatism thing, we lost, it ended in fiasco, and therefore the problem must have been that it was too centrist on economic policy. And what we really need is a kind of rigorous, pure, small government conservatism. And so the story of Republican politics for the first 4 to 6 years of the Obama administration was this big civil war inside the party between what got labeled the Tea Party and what got labeled the establishment, where both groups, in fact, wanted essentially to draw an incredibly firm line against government spending, to oppose the Obama stimulus, oppose Obamacare, oppose any kind of new spending, focus on the deficit, attack Obama for exploiting the deficit, but meanwhile they then attacked each other about whether it was possible to compromise at all with the Obama White House, or whether it would be better to just, in the way of Ted Cruz in a different portion of his political career, shut down the government, salt the earth, and refuse to compromise at all. That was sort of the internal Republican Civil War. And over this period of time, Republicans did pretty well electorally. They did well in the states, they did well in the governor's mansions, they won back the House in 2010, they eventually won back the Senate in 2014, and a lot of Republicans sort of convinced themselves that this was all the result of the Tea Party. It was the result of taking this hard line against government spending and so on, and that this was, that in fact this was now the path fully back to power. And the only problem with that theory was that in 2012, when Mitt Romney ran for president as a businessman promising to unleash entrepreneurial America, opposing Obamacare all the way, he lost. And lost in a way that surprised a lot of Republicans. It surprised Romney, and that loss didn't really fit this sort of we can be a more libertarian party and the country is on our side vision. But a lot of Republicans sort of declined to totally notice that lesson, I would say. And there were a lot of Republicans who were persuaded that the country was tired of Obama, that Obama was a failed president in various ways, and that 2016 was effectively the year that conservatism would be justly returned to power. And in fact, though, something else was happening in the Obama era. What was happening in the Obama era was two things. First, the recovery under Obama was very, very slow. It was very slow. It was pathetic in 2010 when Republicans won the House, and it continued to be pretty lousy for several years thereafter. And some of this was just that, the Great Recession had dug a big hole. Some of it is that, there's a certain economic literature about how recoveries from financial crises tend to be very slow. And some of it was that there are just underlying problems in the American economy that really go back to the 1970s, where wage-earning America has seen its income stagnate. And even in periods of general growth, middle-class to working-class America does not do as well as it did in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. So you had this kind of sense of economic stagnation. And then you had the fact that the Obama presidency, over this same period, moved substantially to the left on social issues. And it did so because the country was moving to the left on social issues, right? There was a transformation in how people felt about same-sex marriage, so that, the 2004 Bush campaign against same-sex marriage became a distant memory. You had a wave of secularization where people, often younger people, became less and less churched relative to less likely to go to church than people their age had been in the 1970s and 80s. You had growing support for marijuana legalization. You had a whole range of issues on which the country was moving to the left. And so the Obama White House, especially in its second term, moved to the left even faster. And when it couldn't pass an immigration reform, Obama did a bunch of stuff, or tried to do a bunch of stuff, via executive order. He obviously changed his position on same-sex marriage. The Supreme Court ruled on same-sex marriage. He started his second term with a big gun control push, which had been something he hadn't really done much of in his first term. And then there were all kinds of things in the federal bureaucracy that were used to, push different changes in college campuses, using Title IX to sort of enforce liberal priorities in different ways, and pushing transgender rights in various ways, all of which were a big move to the left for the Democratic Party that were similar to what was happening in the country as a whole, but probably moved left a little further and a little faster than the whole country, and definitely moved further left than a lot of white working class American voters. So you had a situation going into 2016 where you had this chunk of voters, mostly white working class Americans, who had swung back and forth between the parties, who had a stronger connection to the Republicans than they had had, obviously, in 1950 or 1960, still didn't love the Republican economic agenda, had maybe voted for Barack Obama in 2008, had voted for him, had maybe stayed home in 2012 in some cases because they didn't like Obama but just thought Romney was a plutocrat, who thought the Democratic Party was moving too far to the left on cultural issues, who were a little bit checked out of these internal Republican debates, and who were basically waiting for someone to come along and speak their language. And the person who came along was Donald Trump. And I think it's an open question to what extent Trump fully grasped what he was doing. But basically, Trump came in and did two things, right, that most Republican politicians would not have done. And the first was that he made an explicit appeal to racial anxiety and resentment. He started his presidential career campaigning as a birther, as someone promoting a racially tinged conspiracy theory about America's first black president. And then he spent his entire campaign repeatedly crossing sort of existing red lines around everything from Mexican immigrants to, attacking a judge ruling against him or potentially ruling against him for, saying that he had dual loyalties because he was part Mexican, to promising, not just to be tough on terror, but to ban all Muslims from abroad from entering the U.S. A whole range of issues that were essentially attempts to play on white American anxieties about specific issues, immigration and terrorism and so on, but in a way that was clearly connected to racial anxiety, fear of demographic change, fear of foreigners, and just plain racism. That was part of Trump's pitch from the start and all the way through. The other part of his pitch was economic populism in a way that went far beyond what most Republican politicians would ever do. And so you saw this again and again during the Republican presidential debates, all 132 of them in 2016. Sorry about that. For my job, I had to watch them all, and so did my wife because she married me. So it was an intense experience. But what you would see again and again is Trump would just say something. He would just say whatever. He would say, we're going to have a big, beautiful health insurance plan, even better than Obamacare. And Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio or Rand Paul would say, well, can you define what that health care plan is? And then when he tried to define it, they would say, well, that isn't conservatism. That's not conservative. And Trump would say, I don't care. Who cares about conservatism? Who cares about like this, body of sort of ideological ideas and taboos and so on that the conservative movement has built up over the last 40 or 50 years? I'm going to do what I want. And what I want to do is we're going to have a huge infrastructure bill. We're going to do something better than Obamacare. We're going to renegotiate trade deals and bring all the jobs back that went to China. We're going to have tax cuts for the middle class. We're going to do a whole range of things that were just more populist and, to be frank, more popular than the existing Republican economic agenda. And it turned out that there was a big part of the Republican coalition that really wanted to hear this combination of messages, that really wanted to hear someone, vocalize racial anxiety, but also wanted to hear someone offer economic populism. There was a big swath of Republican voters who felt like the party as it existed was sort of ignoring their economic concerns, ignoring their economic anxieties, and wasn't offering anything really except more tax cuts for the rich. And they voted for Trump. And they weren't a majority of Republicans, but they were enough to basically carry him through a divided field all the way to the Republican nomination. And then in the general election, basically the same thing happened. Trump had a campaign message that was, sort of culturally conservative and economically populist, and effectively he attacked Hillary Clinton constantly as a tool of the establishment, but also someone who was, who had sort of sold out American workers, who had made all kinds of trade deals that had hollowed out factories and hollowed out communities and had been really bad for working class America. And that message, because he was Trump and because he was racially polarizing and because he didn't seem really prepared to be president, cost him a lot of upper middle class suburban voters who normally vote for Republican politicians. But it won him a segment of working class, mostly white working class voters who had stayed home in 2012 or voted for Obama, who had voted for Obama in 2008, and who happened to be concentrated in states like this one, and Michigan, and Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, that Republicans had very rarely won over the last 20 years, but Donald Trump won them all, and even though he didn't win a majority of the popular vote, he won the presidency. And so he entered the presidency basically as a very different kind of Republican president than we had seen before. He entered it as a politician whose populism had something in common clearly with a lot of the populist politicians winning elections in Europe and even Latin America lately. And he entered it basically with a choice. And that choice is still, in effect, the choice facing the Republican Party today. But Trump has sort of made his version of the choice, I would say, already, right? So Trump's pitch won 46% of the vote. Didn't win a majority, won an electoral college victory. The Trump coalition is not a governing coalition. It's not the coalition that George W. Bush put together in 2004. It lost too many suburban voters. It didn't win enough minority voters, even though he didn't do quite as badly with minority voters as a lot of people expected. And the demographic composition of the country had changed in ways that would tend to shrink the Republican coalition. So to build a new conservatism on the basis of Donald Trump's message, you would need to basically figure out how to expand from 46 to 51 or 52%. And the most plausible way to do it on paper, not necessarily in practice, but on paper, would be to basically say, all right, this populist message solidified the relationship between the white working class and the Republican Party. So, all right, now we're a working class party. Now we're a workers' party, as Trump put it. Where do we go from here? Well, we need to win workers who aren't white. We need to win middle class and working class African Americans and Asians and Hispanics who might appreciate our economic message, might be a little more socially conservative or a little more religious than the Democratic Party norm right now. We need to pull those voters into the Republican coalition. And so the way to do that would basically be for Trump or any Republican politician to gradually or suddenly jettison the kind of racialized appeals and racial dog whistles and double down on the economic populist portion of his message. Trump, as president, has basically done the opposite. When he came out on election night, sort of stunned by his victory, you remember, the first thing he said was, we're going to have a great infrastructure bill. We're going to rebuild our highways and so on, all that kind of stuff. There was no infrastructure bill. There has been no infrastructure bill. There was sort of a middle-class tax cut, but not really much of one. Instead, Trump came in and let the existing institutional Republican Party run its unpopular policy agenda. And that's what happened over the last 2 years. And that unpopular policy agenda consisted of trying to repeal Obamacare without having a particularly appealing replacement, and that failed. And it consisted of passing a big tax cut that was heavily weighted, much more heavily weighted than the Bush tax cuts or the Reagan tax cuts, by the way, towards corporations and the wealthy. And it would have been even more heavily weighted if Marco Rubio hadn't made this sort of extended fight to make sure that it included a larger child tax credit so that middle class and working class families would get a little more of a tax cut. So those were the two big things that the Republican Congress did under Trump, neither of which were particularly popular, neither of which had anything to do with the messages that Trump had used to win the primaries and the general election. So that was not particularly popular. And then meanwhile, what Trump likes to do over the same time is fight culture wars on Twitter and pick fights with NFL players and rage against the Mueller investigation and all the rest of it. And that has been sort of the major public theme of his presidency, with occasional really egregious moments like how he reacted to the violence in Charlottesville, where it seems like if somebody seems to be a fan of his, even if they're pretty clearly a white nationalist, he doesn't want to say anything bad about them. And so that's been basically the sort of, the way the Trump presidency has worked. He's kept the sort of racially charged culture war, and he's dropped a lot of the economic populism. And he sort of groped back towards it in the last week or so before the midterm elections. He suddenly started talking about how we were going to do an extra 5% middle class tax cut. And the media went to Republicans in Congress and they said, well, we have no idea what he's talking about. We're not even in session right now. And he sent out his Secretary of Health and Human Services to talk about negotiating lower prescription drug prices, which was something else he'd promised on the campaign trail that had gone nowhere under his presidency. But basically it was just sort of, oh, the election's coming, I have to act like a populist again. But there was during the actual first 2 years of his presidency, there was no populist follow-through. And the political consequences have been, I think, totally predictable, even though Trump has, for the last 2 years, been enjoying the best economic climate of any president, arguably since Bill Clinton in the late 1990s. His approval ratings have never really broken 42 or 43%. And at the same time, the Republican Party has lost, a lot of seats in the House of Representatives, and has generally seen itself lose a lot of the ground that it gained under Obama. And again, that's in really pretty good economic times. And the voters lost by Republicans over this period include a bunch of those working class voters who had voted for Obama and voted for Trump in the upper Midwest. A lot of those voters swung back to Democrats in 2018, suggesting that whatever Trump had done had not actually fully realigned them into the Republican coalition. And now it seems not definitive, but certainly possible that the economic landscape over the next 2 years won't be as good. And it seems quite likely that at the end of the day, Donald Trump will be defeated for re-election, and he'll end up sort of having not expanded, but shrunken the Republican coalition from where it was when Mitt Romney ran for president in 2012. So that I think is sort of the story of sort of, in a certain weird way, the genius of Trump, and then also the story, so far at least, of the failure of Trump. That Trump grasped what a lot of Republican politicians had not grasped, which was that there was this big piece of the Republican coalition, this big working class piece that didn't feel like the party was listening to them, that felt like it was economically struggling, that felt like it had been forgotten by both parties, that was waiting for someone to come along and speak to them. Trump totally grasped that. And yet, at the same time, he was unable to see that that was not a sufficient basis for an actual conservative populist realignment. It was a sufficient basis maybe for one narrow electoral college win, but in the end, in the United States, maybe not in other countries, but in the United States, a conservative populism would have to be pan-ethnic and multiracial, or it couldn't exist as a governing coalition at all. And I think it's pretty clear that Donald Trump isn't the right politician to pull off a pan-ethnic, multiracial, you're chuckling for a good reason, pan-ethnic and multiracial conservative coalition. But I think, you're chuckling, but there is a part of Trump, right, I think that grasped this. Like, you can see it in sort of his groping outreach to Kanye West. You can see it in his sort of, halting support for the First Step Act and criminal justice reform. Going all the way back to his career on The Apprentice. The Apprentice was a big hit with African Americans and Hispanics. There's a side of Trump that sort of weirdly wants to do racial outreach. It's just that it's overwhelmed by the other side of Donald Trump that wants to do something very different. And so where he's probably, I say probably, a lot can change in 2 years, but probably going to leave American conservatism is in a situation where, to the extent that it is holding these working class voters, who it gradually won over the course of the last 50 years, it's holding them on the basis of racial resentment and demographic anxiety, rather than on the basis of a sort of coherent populist governing agenda that might appeal beyond that base. And at the same time, by doing so, it's losing a lot of not just minority voters, but white upper middle class voters who don't want to be associated with that message. And so the question, I think, for the conservative politicians who come after Trump, the Republican politicians who come after Trump, is it possible to do this differently? Is it possible? Is conservative populism by its nature racially charged? There are a lot of my liberal friends who would argue that it is, basically, that it's inevitable. If you're a conservative populist, you're going to end up making racial and racist appeals, and you're never going to be able to win over enough minority voters to build your coalition. Or could it be that there's a kind of conservative nationalism that could encompass multiple ethnic groups, multiple racial groups, around a message that, like Trump's message, emphasizes the fact that lots of Americans haven't done well in the economy of the last 30 years, that, like Trump's message and like a lot of conservative messaging, emphasizes that there's tremendous social breakdown in the United States, that social and cultural liberalism, I don't think, knows what to do about, and that does so with an economic agenda that is, is seen by most Americans as speaking to their actual problems, their actual everyday problems. And I think that that possibility, it may not be realistic, but if you can describe it, it has to be in some sense realistic. And I think that is the possibility that is still out there to be grasped by a post-Trump conservatism, not just returning to where the party was when it was Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan running for president in 2012, because that message ultimately failed, and not just trying the Trump playbook again and again and again in a diversifying country as your share of the electorate shrinks and shrinks and shrinks, but trying to learn something from Trump's successes, trying to see the things that he got right, while also stiff-arming the darker portions of his agenda, and trying to create something that actually creates the thing that has ultimately eluded the Republican Party, even through all its political successes over the last 30 or 40 years, a real enduring governing majority built around working class America. So I'll leave my rambling historical interpretation there. Thank you so much for listening, and we can talk about whatever you guys want. I'm just going to call on people. Should they stand up and project loudly? Okay. Don't be shy. Yes.
Hi. So, what do you think the recent Democrat victory in the House of Representatives really spells out for Trump in both the short term and the long term?
In the short term, so the question is, what does the Democrats' victory in the House mean for Trump, short term and long term? I mean, in the short term, it means that he's going to be investigated till it hurts, basically. The House Democrats have an extremely long list of subjects that they really, really are excited to look into, ranging from like Jared Kushner's relationship to Saudi businessmen to, people sort of, even something as minor as like Trump's hotels in DC and why foreign dignitaries keep staying in them and so on, extending all the way through everything that the Russia investigation is doing, and going on through the various misadventures of many of his cabinet secretaries. So I think that the opportunities, on paper, you could imagine a world where with a Democratic House, Trump sort of pivots back to economic populism and says, oh, remember that infrastructure bill? Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, let's make a deal after all. And I think part of Trump would like to do that, and there's probably some modest Democratic support for it. But I think in practice, all the Democrats are going to be running for president really, really soon. And there's incredible pressure from within the Democratic base to investigate the hell out of Trump. And I think that convergence of the incentives of Democrats running for president and the desire for investigations means that's basically all that we're going to get for the next year or so. It's going to be jockeying among Democratic senators and governors and Beto O'Rourke to see who gets to be in pole position for the nomination, and it's going to be just a lot of investigations that keep Trump scandals in the news. So that's sort of the next, that's sort of the short term. I mean, to the extent that there's something long term, I think this isn't sort of Trump specific, but I've been talking about this in class terms, right, in terms of sort of working class America versus college educated America, right? There's a big political divide by education in the US, but it's also a big urban-rural divide. Like, that's obviously a huge part of the story here. And the changes, what the Democrats have done in the House means, and some of their victories in state houses means that they're well positioned for House victories going forward, I think. I think it's reasonable to expect the Democrats to hold the House, barring some radical transformation over the next few cycles. At the same time, that urban-rural split and the way the Senate is weighted towards rural states in various ways means that it's pretty easy to imagine a world where Democrats keep winning the House, they win back the presidency, and Republicans keep holding like a 51-49 majority in the Senate for a little while. So I think it's the lesson of, this isn't a lesson for Trump, it's a lesson for Democrats, or lesson, whatever you want to call it. Probably not 2 years away from the glorious Democratic return to policymaking. We are 4 to 6. Like you could very easily imagine a scenario where the whole Democratic strategy ends up being, first we elect Amy Klobuchar president, and then we need her to win re-election while finally winning the Senate in 2024, and then we do Medicare for all, or whatever our big golden dream is. So I think we're a ways away from the Democrats realizing whatever their next big golden policy goal is. Yeah. Sir.
I'm thinking a little late, so you may have addressed this, but could you elaborate a little bit more on the role of the energy region?
Sure. I didn't really talk about Newt that much. I mean, I think Newt is important for a story about sort of changing norms in Washington. I think that analysis is basically right, that the Gingrich's theory was that the minority party should work less with the majority party and work harder to defeat them. And that was one, a successful political strategy in that it won Republicans the House for the first time in decades, and two, a strategy that had a generally transformative effect on sort of how Washington worked. And Democrats learned that lesson too, right? I mentioned the failed push for Social Security reform in 2004. There was a big assumption among a lot of Democrats after 2004 that, Bush would put forward a proposal and, you would come up with a counter proposal and then you would negotiate, because that's how Washington worked. And Nancy Pelosi, having learned the lesson of Newt Gingrich, basically said, hell no, we're not offering any counter proposals. Let them pass it. Let them pass this if they can. So in that sense, I think Gingrich's ascent is sort of a hinge point in a story about how we got a more polarized Washington and a more gridlocked Washington. In terms of the story of sort of the composition of the coalitions, though, the story I was trying to tell, I think Gingrich is interesting because the contract with America is a good example of the kind of thing that successful Republican campaigns for working class votes tended to offer. If you go back and read the contract with America, it's not talking about dramatic government cutting. It's not talking about ending Medicare or Social Security or anything like that. It's offering a mix of, crime bill and welfare reform, sort of stuff in that race, crime, and urban policy tangle, and then it offered a child tax credit, like Marco Rubio did much later, and then a bunch of sort of process-oriented good government reforms. So it's an example of how, in its more successful moments, even the Reagan and Gingrich era Republican Party, it was never winning working class votes by promising sort of full throttle libertarianism. And in fact, once Gingrich got into a battle with Bill Clinton, where Clinton was able to say, Newt Gingrich wants to cut Medicare, then Gingrich lost power and influence very quickly. So in that sense, I think the Gingrich era is a case study in sort of the limits of the libertarian pitch to working class voters and the extent to which a sort of we're social conservatives and economic centrists and we want to reform welfare was a much more successful Republican pitch, I think. Sir.
So you spoke to some extent about the sort of inherent tensions that we're seeing between sort of the more conservative side of the working class and the Republican sort of ideological orthodoxy. I was wondering if you could broaden that analysis to the extent that for conservatism to work, there has to be some sense of people having something to conserve, right? So as, let's say on the cultural front, or we can take the economic front, if you've got a culture that's constantly marching sort of, as you described, sort of on a progressive trajectory, at what point is that sort of, where does the GOP go with that in terms of what are they conserving if society is becoming sort of, with what you're conserving, right, is by definition, sort of progressive or liberal, right? So where does the GOP sort of go with that? How would you take that analysis?
Yeah, so one way to think about American conservatism sort of at its most high-minded, right, is that it says, okay, let's go back to Alexis de Tocqueville. What makes American society distinctive, right? Tocqueville comes over in the early 19th century and he says, here are all the things that make Americans different from Europeans. And it's, you know, they have a stronger civic culture, they have a stronger religious culture with all the sort of competing denominations instead of an established church. They have strong families. It's that America is basically a sort of commercial yet communitarian society. And so you can actually make sense of the different elements in the conservative coalition that don't always fit together ideologically, right? They're all defending different pieces of American exceptionalism. The libertarians are defending the sort of commercial republic. The social conservatives are defending the, very religious relative to Europe, America. The limited government people are defending sort of the decentralized, localist, suspicious of the central state thing. So all of that, I think, again, it's more high-minded than reality, but it's a fair way of thinking about what conservatives think they're trying to conserve. So yeah, then the question is, all right, well, we've lived through 30 or 40 years in which Tocquevillian America has seemed to go into pretty steep decline, right? And this is, the sort of, again, set right here in Ohio, the last Robert Putnam book about sort of the decline of working class community. There've been sort of a spate of books by people like Putnam and Charles Murray and others that have sort of tracked the deterioration or disintegration of sort of civic and communal and religious life everywhere except for the upper middle class. And that has, I think, been a big part of this sort of crisis for conservatism that has sort of, again, produced the Trump era, right? Because, for a long time, I think conservatives persuaded themselves that there was this sort of basic civic health in the United States, and that if you just sort of pulled back the dead hand of bureaucracy and just sort of carved away the regulatory state and didn't let secular Supreme Court justices, rewrite the Constitution to be hostile to Christianity or something. If you just did all that, there would be this sort of bottom-up social and civic flourishing. And I think the lesson of the last 20 or 25 years is, if that was true once, it's not true now. And in fact, you have this sort of ongoing social disintegration that's sort of been brought to its sharpest and most horrifying point by the opioid crisis. So in that situation, I think conservatives generally have an impulse, a correct impulse, that you need to figure out how to restore solidarity at some level. American society, outside of really successful upper middle class enclaves, is sort of dying for want of solidarity. The question is, how do you do that? It's really hard, right? I mean, one of the key conservative insights is that it's hard for government programs to sort of fix social fabric. Government programs are good at writing checks, they're good at transferring money, they're good at sort of creating a safety net. They're not always as good at figuring out, how do you have flourishing families, right? And so you've had these sort of recurring efforts. This is part of what compassionate conservatism wanted to do. It's part of what, this mini movement that I was associated with called Reform Conservatism wanted to do, where the idea was, well, you'll figure out, you'll make the tax code more family friendly, and you'll have wage subsidies to help working class America, earn more money. And if you can, the theory being, if you can shore up the economic foundations of working class life a little more than the existing conservative policy agenda wants to do, that at least provides the preconditions for people to get married again and have stable two-parent families again and be civically involved again and go to church again and so on. That's basically one theory. But it's, as much as I sort of think it's worth trying, it's also a little bit of a stretch, right? You are sort of trying to use government policy to re-knit the social fabric is like trying to push a string uphill in certain ways. And there are alternatives to that, right? I mean, part of the appeal of the sort of white identity politics portion of Trumpism is not it's not even about like the fear of the Mexican or African American other. It's about an idea of like a tribe, right? That like somebody's looking out for you. You're a white American, and everybody else has got their, you know, multicultural coalition or whatever. And in a fragmenting society, why shouldn't you take pride in white identity? And it's sort of using political rhetoric to create a kind of, I think, toxic but real sort of cultural solution. And, you know, as I said in the original talk, I think it's sort of self-limiting in certain ways in political terms, but it's not necessarily self-limiting in cultural terms, right? There are sort of adrift, unhappy young white Americans who are finding actual forms of solidarity online and elsewhere in sort of a kind of white identitarian ethos. And, you know, when I go and give talks in sort of conservative contexts, you know, like you go to a sort of a religious school in North Carolina and you talk to parents afterwards, you know, sort of teenage kids who would have been sort of normal young evangelicals or something 20 or 25 years ago are online being sort of tempted by, again, more sort of identitarian alternatives. And in that sense, I think Trump tapped into something real, right? That when sort of healthy forms of solidarity fail, tribal forms of solidarity become more and more appealing. So I think that's sort of the I mean, I guess you could just call it a dilemma or a choice or something, but, you know, you can try and use policy to fix things that maybe policy can't fix, or you can sort of give in to the solidarity provided by tribalism. And this isn't just racial, right? Like the nature, I mean, started out tonight with quotes from Twitter, right? Like the internet provides a sort of ersatz solidarity in a lot of different forms. It's not just identity politics. It's also just like the solidarity of yelling at someone on the internet and feeling like you're on a team that's sort of at war with another team and so on. So there's a lot of, society abhors a vacuum, and there are a lot of different forms of solidarity that are emerging out of the wreckage of the old familial, religious, and civic culture. And the question is whether there's anything that policymakers can do to revive that culture, and I'm really not sure what the answer is. Yes?
It's interesting, you mentioned Karl Rove under George W. and all the strategy that went into their campaigns, and then talking about Trump during the primaries. Do you think that he really had a strategy and knew what he was doing, or is it possible he's just a deeply unintelligent person who got very, very lucky?
I mean, I think Trump had, you know, he had the devil's luck, you might say, right? Like you can tell a whole set of stories where one or two small things didn't happen along the way to the White House and he never got there, right? Like everything from, you know, the James Comey intervention at the very end of the election to Marco Rubio briefly turning into a robot on the stage in New Hampshire, you know, to Jeb Bush staying in the race way too long, to, you know, I mean, there are infinite points at which you can say Trump's victory was contingent, he was incredibly lucky, and so on. And I don't think that he ever had, you know, a sort of coherent 10-point, here's what I'm going to do kind of thing. But, you know, he is smart in a certain way. He has a certain, you know, he wouldn't be who he is and where he is without a certain kind of intelligence and a certain kind of instinct and a certain kind of sense of sort of what's going on in the world. I mean, this is a guy who has reinvented himself repeatedly and been, you know, repeatedly written off as sort of this washed up joke, and then sort of come back with a new identity and a new brand and a new persona, and now he's president of the United States. So I think there are people who get into this sort of like, oh my God, Trump, you know, Trump always wins when we didn't think he was going to win, and therefore he can't be defeated or something, and that's not true. But it is true that he grasped something real. And it was strategic. Like, the birtherism was strategic. Like, Donald, I mean, he obviously really, really, really didn't like Barack Obama and felt belittled by him and all the rest, and that played into it. But he also, you know, he sort of saw an opening to be the guy who would say certain things that a chunk of the Republican base wanted to hear that other Republican politicians rightly didn't want to say, So that was strategic. There are ways in which his long-standing worldview sort of caught up with the times, right? That, you know, he had spent most of his life warning that other countries were taking advantage of us, and he happened to finally run for president at a moment when a lot of people sort of decided belatedly that how we related to China from the 1990s onward hadn't worked out as well as we'd hoped. And so in a sense there, it was sort of his long-standing instincts meeting the moment. But, you know, it was also, I mean, part of Trump's strategy was like just sort of weirdly obvious, right? Like, they got on a plane and they flew to parts of the country where people had lost jobs, and they promised to bring back the jobs, right? Like, that's how he ran for president. He did a lot of other stuff too, but that's what he did. And, you know, he didn't actually have a plan to bring back the jobs, so in that sense there was that underlying weakness. But there was also a sense in which it was much smarter than, you know, I mean, a lot of what has gone on in Republican politics, especially since the failure of compassionate conservatism, has been Republican politicians saying what they think conservative activists and a set of conservative donors want to hear. And Trump decided to say what voters wanted to hear, and it was more effective. And, you know, that's, I mean, there are a lot of things not to like about it, but it's politics, it's democratic politics, and you can't blame him for doing what worked in that sense. So, yeah. Sir.
Given that the only Republicans only Republican politicians outside of Trump's orbit are either retired or defeated, do you think there is, how can there be a future for the Republican Party that's not the party of Trump?
I don't think there is a future for the Republican Party that lies in repudiating Trump. I don't think there's going to be a moment, I think there'll be a moment 25 years from now when Republican politicians are willing to say, yeah, Trump, you know, that wasn't great. But I think in the short term, the future for the Republican Party is either just riding the sort of white identity politics rocket all the way down towards oblivion, or ideally saying what I think some Republicans in the Senate and elsewhere want to say, which is Trump, you know, I don't agree with how Trump says things, and I want to do more outreach to minorities and so on, but Trump got some important things right, and I'm a populist too, right? I think that's the most plausible path forward for the GOP. And the truth is, again, that, like, you know, Trump is not happening in a vacuum, right? Like, nationalism is a powerful force in conservative politics, and not only conservative politics in pretty much every Western country, plus, you know, Brazil, Mexico is governed by a left-wing populist now. Like, populism it's just a reality that politicians of both parties have to work with. And in that sense, too, you know, there isn't some future for the Republican Party in just saying, all right, you know, that was a huge mistake and we're just going back to where we were in 1980. It's a very different world than 1980, and conservatism has to work with the world as it actually exists. And the world as it actually exists wants clearly some kind of conservatism that is a little more skeptical of globalization and a little more focused on national solidarity than the party was at a different moment in world history, I think. But I mean, in the short term, you know, I mean, Mitt Romney will be in the Senate. It'll be interesting to see what he does. It's not entirely true that sort of every Trump skeptical Republican has disappeared, but the nature of losing an election the way Trump's party just did is that the most Trump skeptical Republicans are also the most vulnerable ones, so they were the ones who tended to lose. So in that sense, as the party shrinks, it will get, for a little while at least, Trumpier, just by necessity. So, sir.
So, piggybacking off that question, going forward economically, is the Republican Party ever able to return to the conservatism of like Buckley or Breitbart or even Ron Paul? Or is it just doomed to go forward and basically mimic the Democrats and going centrist economically?
I mean, I think it varies issue by issue, right? I mean, there are a lot of Ron Paul voters who really like Donald Trump. And I went to Freedom Fest, which is the big libertarian convocation, confab in Las Vegas, and about half the people there were like, I'm a principled libertarian and Donald Trump is a populist and I really don't like him. And the other half were like, I'm a libertarian, but I love Donald Trump because he sticks it to the establishment and so on. So I think, so there's a certain kind of cultural continuity in certain ways between Trump and parts of libertarianism, even though Trump is ideologically not a libertarian. But no, I mean, I do think that, again, the landscape may change. You might, fiscal pressures might increase. You might have a situation that sort of creates openings for more libertarian economic policy. But in general, I think the clearest influence of libertarian ideas in the Republican Party in this populist era is going to be on foreign policy, not domestic policy. I think it's more likely going forward that you'll have conservatives not going like full isolationist or anything like that, but not at all going back to sort of George W. Bush's democracy promotion agenda and so on, and becoming much more skeptical of overseas interventions and so on. So I think that's the part of the sort of Paulite message that really resonates with Republican voters right now. And it was the part that Trump picked up, right? Trump was the, least neoconservative, least idealistic, he spent the whole primary campaign attacking the Iraq War. So that I think is alive and well. But I think the sort of at the very least, let me put it this way, Paul Ryan conservatism, the conservatism of let's do a really big Medicare reform, that's dead. It'll come back on paper and in blueprints and so on, but it won't come back for real unless there's a fiscal crisis. Until then, it's dead. Sir.
Yeah, this is a bit of an unfair question, maybe a subject of another talk, but you said these things don't happen in a vacuum. What about the Democratic Party's reactionary response to this? From the portrait you paint is their best bet is to just sit back and let it all fall apart.
Yes.
But
yes,
that may or may not happen. So what would you project forward?
I mean, so
right now, so basically Hillary Clinton sort of got caught betwixt and between, right? Hillary's campaign said, okay, Trump is making this pitch to working class voters, and we don't really need to counter that much because we're going to win all of these suburbanites and especially suburban women who were turned off by Trump. And they did win a bunch of those voters. But because of the way the Electoral College worked, they won extra votes in Texas and Georgia and states where they weren't close enough to get over the top. And they lost working class votes in the upper Midwest, and they lost the Electoral College. So that's a good example of how sort of democratic strategy can fail in this kind of context. But I think at the moment, Democrats have a sort of best of both worlds scenario where because Trump didn't govern as an economic populist, he isn't holding on to completely those Obama-Trump voters that he won. And at the same time, he's turned off more suburbanites, more college-educated women. And so Democrats in 2020 can sort of, keep their cool and just sort of run a pretty conventional campaign, and hope to basically do both. They don't have to sort of pick do we win back the working class voters or do we go for the suburban voters? They just do both. I think Trump makes that, even without a recession, but especially with a recession, Trump makes that almost too easy for them. So but then the question is, what do Democratic primary voters actually want? And here, I'm really just not sure. I don't get any clarity from the polls right now about what Democratic primary voters want. I don't think they want their own Trump, like the people who looked at Michael Avenatti and said, oh, he's going to be the Democratic nominee because the Democrats want their own Trump. No, Democrats might want their own Trump at some point, but we're a few election cycles away from that, I think. but I'm not sure whether, I think the Democratic field looks very fractured right now. It's not clear to me exactly where the fault lines are. You have these candidates like Joe Biden who are like poll technically in the lead, but seem totally out of step with where the energy in the party is. You have this sort of leadership turnover where the younger part of the party is increasingly Black, Hispanic, and female, and the older leadership of the party is still very white. And that sort of manifested itself in primary campaigns in this cycle, and maybe it'll manifest itself in the next campaign, but I'm just babbling here. I honestly, I'm very curious about what's going to happen. There's like a contingent of Democrats who think that they're going to nominate Beto O'Rourke, which is sort of stunning to me. Like it seems sort of crazy, but maybe that's the right call. You know, being charismatic and winning 48% of vote in Texas. If you just literally transpose that to the national electorate, you're president. That's true. Seems a little weird. I think the Democrats should nominate, Amy Klobuchar, which is why I name-checked her earlier. I think like that's, she's a very popular politician who runs well ahead of her party in a state that had sort of tilted towards Trump a little bit. And I think, running a sort of reassuring, likable figure is a really good idea for Democrats. But, she's polling at 1%. It's not clear to me how she would make the leap. So I really don't know how. I think Democrats are going to win in 2020, but I don't know what the party wants in a candidate right now, and obviously that will affect the strategy they end up with. Let's do, it's 10 of 9. Let's do 2 more. Does that sound good? I don't want to, I can go all night, but it's probably a bad idea. So, sir.
I'm curious about how your idea of expanding the pan-ethnic coalition for conservatives, how that kind of squares with what we see at the state level as the GOP often trying to shrink the election. It seems like a counter. A counter movement going on.
Yeah, I think the Republican Party in general has adopted a sort of bunker mentality around demographic change, where it's sort of like, well, the Senate gives us certain advantages, so we can hold the Senate, and at the state level, we don't mind shrinking the electorate because we're worried about what a larger electorate would mean. I think that strategy tends to be pretty counterproductive. Like, I think the main effect of voter ID laws and things like that tends to be to mobilize opposition to them among minority voters. So I neither think that Republican voter ID laws, push voter ID laws, are an excellent idea because voter fraud is not actually a big problem in America, nor do I think they're an existential threat to American democracy because they seem to be pretty easily swamped by turnout operations. Mostly I think they're an example of Republicans just not trying to expand their coalition, saying, how do we, if we have 47 or 48% of the vote, how do we get to that 50.1 and sort of hold on to power, which is basically what they did in Florida and Georgia to some extent. But I think it's a strategy that is temporary. It's not going to work long term. I think liberals shouldn't panic over it and freak out over it. But I think it should be ultimately abandoned by Republicans if they want. This is a general problem in our politics. It's not just a Republican problem, but it's particularly pronounced among Republicans right now that nobody seems to think it's imaginable that they could have a 56% coalition again. Maybe it's not, right? Maybe polarization just works the way it works now, and we're always going to be swinging back between 52% and 52% and so on. But the way you actually govern the country often is to figure out how to win a big majority, not just a narrow majority. And right now, neither political party seems to have a clear plan to do that, but the Republicans especially. All right, last question. Yes, ma'am.
Can you speak to the anti-democratic impulse in the GOP that we've seen both in North Carolina and the efforts to rein in their Democratic governor in 2 years ago, and then most recently in the attacks by the Wisconsin legislature against the newly elected Democratic Party.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of that, again, I think some of the claims that there's some new wildly anti-democratic GOP are a little overblown. Like if you look at Wisconsin, right, like it was just a few years ago that the Democrats were trying to recall the duly elected governor of Wisconsin in the middle of his term, and Democratic legislators were literally leaving the state in order to prevent a quorum to pass that same governor's legislation. So, I would say the same thing I said in response to the last question. I think these reflect a poverty of political imagination by Republicans. I think that they reflect a sort of, just sort of an element in the party that can't really imagine itself expanding its coalitions, and so is just looking for sort of ways to hang on to power with the narrowest possible majorities. And in that sense, I think they're bad. But I think they generally, and I can't speak to every specific case, but you know, the elected legislature changing the powers of the governor is not, you know, it's not, I mean, it may be happening in a gerrymandered context, but it's not sort of an assault on democracy per se. It's an example of sort of partisanship impacting how, you know, the different separated powers within a separation of power system fight with each other. So it doesn't seem to me, again, to rise to the level of a sort of, you know, the Republican Party is now an authoritarian party that's sort of destroying democracy or something. A lot of it still seems to fall within like the range of, again, the stuff Democrats threw up against Scott Walker when he was governor. So I spend a lot of time having conversations with liberals basically like this one, where I say, yeah, I don't think that's a good idea, but I don't think it should be sort of a source of panic. I think it's just a reason for Democrats to sort of mobilize themselves a bit further and win elections, as they have pretty successfully done in the last 18 months. Should we take one last question? Since it's not yet 9 o'clock, let's take one last question. Yes?
Thank you for your teaching.
You're very welcome.
I wanted to ask a question about your job. We live in, I think, a period where we're pretty saturated with opinion. We have opinion from virtually everywhere. And we also live in a period where people are kind of, they read mostly what they agree with. And I was wondering, within that context, how you and your colleagues who do opinion pieces think about your role and if it's evolved and changed as a result.
That's a very good question. I mean, the op-ed columnist is in an interesting position, because it used to be that we were sort of the most opinionated part of the news, and like the place where you would find sort of, you know, in a sort of generally neutral, or at least pretending to be neutral or trying to be neutral media environment. The op-ed page was like the place you'd go to get strong views and so on. And now we're sort of like the fuddy-duddy old guard, you know, writing our 800 to 1,000 word columns while people on the internet sort of, you know, fire flaming arrows at us all day. So, I mean, I'm in a distinctive position because I am a conservative columnist writing for a newspaper that you may have heard has a slightly left of center readership. So I can't speak to exactly how my more liberal colleagues think of their jobs. I would say that I think of myself as someone who is very fortunate, in the sense that we live in a landscape where most people who write opinions and express opinions for a living are expressing them for the purpose of sort of, you know, cheering on their own side and shoring up their own base and feeling, again, solidarity with people who share the same opinion and so on. And I get to do something different. I get to I write columns for people who generally don't agree with me, and while I spend a certain amount of time criticizing Republicans and Donald Trump, and New York Times readers always like it when I do that, I also spend a certain amount of time writing columns that my readers very strongly disagree with. And that's sort of challenging in the sense that sometimes I write columns that make Twitter very, very angry, but it's also a great gift and I'm lucky to be able to do it. And I don't have sort of a 10-point plan for how we as a society can get to a point where more people are reading people they disagree with. But in general, when I give advice to people who are consumers of opinion, which I imagine some of you are, I urge them very strongly to spend a certain amount of their reading time figuring out 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 1 or 2 or 3 writers with whom they generally disagree and nonetheless respect. And here's the key, that doesn't mean finding the person who is officially a conservative, but 6 out of every 7 columns they write are attacking Donald Trump. You want to find the person who's a conservative, if you're a liberal, who maybe is attacking Donald Trump 2 out of 7 columns, but is challenging you the other 5 times. And the same goes the other way. If you're a conservative who wants to read liberals, you don't want to read someone who's always telling you, oh, you know, here's why my own party is in disarray. You want to find people who challenge you in ways that you respect. And that's hard. That's hard. The nature of our politics right now means that very often people find themselves unable to respect at all people who are writing things that they disagree with. But there are a lot of really, really smart writers out there on both sides of the political divide, on all sides of the political divide, because it's a pretty complicated political landscape right now. And, you know, if you're a serious reader who cares about politics, you can find people who you disagree with, who will challenge you week in and week out. And so it doesn't have to be me, but it should be somebody. Read to disagree as well as to be infuriated and, you know, urged to the battlements and everything else. So, sorry, last question, host privilege.
Who should read, right? So at least that's it. Like, who should, you know, conservatives read? Who people really good, like names of people, and who.
You can't ask name or not name people. That's, you know.
Who do you think?
Well, I mean, I can.
You know, my job, it's like a fire hose, right? It's like drinking from a fire hose. But, you know, I mean, I think one thing you can do is, and you know, these still exist, right? Even in the age of the internet, is read periodicals and publications that come out on a quarterly or monthly or every year schedule or something. And, you know, so if you are right of center and you want to engage with the left, you should not, I mean, you know, get a subscription to not just The Nation, but to a magazine like N+1 or Jacobin, which are these sort of semi-obscure, though not to academically inclined socialists, publications. And you will get some really smart writing by people who are basically Marxists that will infuriate you, but will also offer you, I think, a really interesting perspective. And if you're on the left, you know, a publication like Modern Age, which is a sort of long-standing conservative journal going back to the Russell Kirk era, that's now edited by Dan McCarthy, who is a really smart, legitimately pro-Trump conservative intellectual. You know, so that's an example, as well as sort of more obvious things like Commentary or First Things, and so on. I mean, The Weekly Standard, right, which is a publication that was all in for the Iraq War and was totally wrong about that, but is an incredibly rich place for right-of-center real journalism, real profiles, and so on. It's in some trouble right now, and there's, you know, a lot of talk about whether it will survive, and I don't know whether it will survive, but if it does a lot of really good journalism that liberals as well as conservatives could profit from reading. So I'm giving you publications rather than writers, but I think that's a good way to think about it. It's finding magazines that aren't on the Twitter schedule, that aren't on the daily news schedule, that are, I mean, another example, American Affairs, which is started by some semi-pro-Trump young conservative intellectuals who I think are now less pro-Trump, and it runs a really diverse array of weird writers, and it comes out like 3 times or 4 times a year. Totally worth your time. So there's a lot of stuff like that, in addition to, of course, the New York Times op-ed page, you know, which is a rich intellectual feast every day of the week. All right, thank you guys so much.